This podcast is going to talk about ethnic differences in hair. So this is not specifically about hairline design or hairline shape or things of that nature, but the actual hair itself. So I'm going to broadly define hair caliber, curl, color, contrast in terms of broadly Asian, African, Hispanic, and white. So the white hair has a great degree of variability. It can be straight, it can be curly, but it is typically never very, very kinky or significantly curled like the African hair. The African hair typically is very coarse. It's dark, it's thick, it is almost C-shaped. And so when you go below the skin, even when I see a pretty curly hair for a white person or Caucasian person, underneath the skin, it is still relatively straight. That is not the case with African hair. So it's quite curled onto itself. And that coil you can see above and below the skin. And in a moment, I'll tell you why that's important, okay? With Hispanic hair, it typically is a little bit coarser, a little bit darker, a little bit thicker, and it can have all different shapes and sizes. And part of the reason for the diversity when we talk about Hispanic is a very broad category. If you have heard the term mestizo, it refers to whether that person has African blood from the slave trade from from a century ago or over a century ago. It could be indigenous Indian, or however you want to call it, the people that were there, like the Aztecs and Incas, that predated the conquests of the Americas by the Europeans, and they have more Asian features because some of these probably came over from the Bering Strait from Asia. So those Asian qualities, which we'll discuss in a moment. And then there are white features because those are the conquistadors, the colonizers that came over. And so this mixed blood of Hispanic is such a broad category that is very hard to define. That brings us to Asian hair. Asian hair typically is quite straight. Now, of course, there's variations like Indian, etc., which may have more curl to it, but I'm talking about sort of East Asian, such as Japan, China, Korea. That hair is typically very coarse, thick, straight. There are not a lot of, there's not as much density in the hair. There's typically, when hairs grow in clusters, they grow more often in 2 hair clusters rather than 3 hair clusters, so there are fewer hairs per cluster. And I'm Asian, so my hairs are actually quite straight and coarse, and there's variations of that, of course. Middle Eastern hair is also typically quite coarse and dark. There can be some curl to it. It depends on, what type. I do quite a few Persian or Iranian types of hair transplants, and their hairs typically are quite coarse. There's oftentimes a little bit of a curl to it, but it's not significant. But again, it's all different. The other thing that's very important is why are these important? Because it is much harder to harvest and dissect African hair, even though we do quite a few of those here, and it requires a different skill set to harvest a very curled hair underneath the skin, so it's important to know that. Oftentimes, if I see someone that looks darker complected, I may ask them what their ethnicity is and their history of their lineage, and it's not meant to be racist or anything like that. But for example, if I know that someone is, let's say, 50% has African blood, but 50% is generally Hispanic, but they're not significantly black or dark, then I know that their hair caliber typically is relatively straight. So my harvesting technique, whether it's for FUE or linear strip, will be quite different. So it helps me understand what I'm going to be encountering during the time of the surgery. So I have found in my own anecdotal experiences that someone that is 50% non-black will have hairs that are similar to, or they'll still have a curl, but it will be not that curly, and it will start to behave more like halfway between non-black and non-black. Well, obviously that makes sense at 50%. Asian hairs dissect differently. The harvesting will be different just because it's much coarser and straighter. And so these are differences in the actual hair quality and the clinical import of what I'm dealing with when I'm thinking about ethnicity. And now there's a whole different subject about hairline design, et cetera, about different ethnicities. This podcast is specifically talking about sort of ethnic differences in the hair quality and caliber.